move to, up next is Noah Shaw, who co-chairs the renewable practice at Hodgson Russ, which is a premier clean energy law firm operating significant presence in New York, but they are not just a New York firm. Noah's former position was general counsel for NYSERDA, and he is one of the primary authors of the CLCPA, the Climate Leadership Community Protection Act. But he denies being responsible for the acronym, which has to rank about in the bottom 10% of memorable acronyms. So Noah, take it away.
Well, thank you, Tom. Appreciate that introduction. It's a real pleasure to be here. A lot has happened since Peter Fusaro reached out to me earlier this year and asked me to talk about offshore wind 2.0 here in New York State. In fact, I'd say New York is now on the cusp of offshore wind 3.0 with a line of sight to even more iterations beyond that. And the next few months will be both here in New York and industry pivotal. So what I'd like to do is just briefly recap where we are with respect to New York's second offshore wind solicitation, which was up for 2,500 megawatts of renewable energy credits. Set the stage for what we hope will be round 3 in 2021, and note a few possibilities and potential impediments to progress that tend to get less attention. Any discussion of offshore wind here in New York starts with the market signal heard around the world from last year's Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, the CLCPA. That is the requirement that the state have installed 9,000 megawatts of offshore wind by 2035 and have achieved 70% renewable energy consumption by 2030. 9,000 megawatts is projected to be almost 1/3 of the state's total electricity load in 2035. Last year, we made the first 2 big steps toward that goal by executing contracts with 2 major projects, as many of you may have heard, showing the success of New York's solicitation design, I would say, and index rec contract structure, for which I will humbly take some credit. Sunrise Wind is an 880 megawatt project located about 30 miles off the tip of Montauk. That is a joint venture of Ørsted and Eversource with an expected commercial operation date in 2024. And Empire Wind is an 816 megawatt project being developed by Equinor and now owned 50-50 with BP as of not long ago, located about 20 miles south of Jones Beach off Long Island, also with an expected commercial operation date in 2024. In April of this year, the state's Public Service Commission issued its order authorizing NYSERDA, the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority, to issue its next solicitation, this time for up to 2,500 megawatts. That RFP was issued on July 21st. Bids are due October 20th, and NYSERDA has stated that it expects to be able to announce the next round of executed contracts in the 4th quarter of this year, though you can count me as thinking that time frame might be a bit optimistic. 3 important factors may impact bidding behavior in a slightly different way this time around than with the first solicitation. First, this second solicitation differed from the first in that it required bidders to include in their submission an in-state port facility with which they had partnered, potentially a heavy lift to arrange in time for the bid deadline. Second, New Jersey's offshore wind solicitation, in which that state is seeking up to 2,400 megawatts, substantially overlaps on the calendar from New York's. Bids are due in New Jersey's RFP on December 10th and may pull from similar lease areas. And third, there is uncertainty for offshore wind at the federal level, tied to the results of November's election, when it comes not only to the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management's willingness to move projects ahead, but also with respect to certainty in the wholesale electricity markets and tax policy. New York continues to set the stage to meet its long-term goals, however. We expect that on October 15th, the Public Service Commission will take up the Department of Public Service and NYSERDA staff proposal for how the state gets to 70% renewable energy by 2030, as required by the aforementioned CLCPA. In that white paper, staff proposed that NYSERDA be given flexible authority to procure from 750 to 1,000 megawatts of offshore wind per year through 2027, exactly the predictable rhythm of procurements that the industry has craved, and flexibility to adjust solicitation design to adapt to changing market conditions without having to go back to the Public Service Commission every time. Staff identified 15 offshore lease areas that could potentially provide projects to New York, though some will surely be scooped up by other states, and expects an LCOE, levelized cost of energy, of around $50 per megawatt by 2030, an extraordinary reduction in cost savings for ratepayers. But separate from NYSERDA's solicitations, the state's very first offshore wind facility, the South Fork project, originally developed by Deepwater Wind and now owned by Ørsted, continues to make progress. At 130 megawatts, the South Fork project promises a significant infusion of renewable energy for Long Island Power Authority customers, though not without some controversy given both the understood cost of the PPA, which was solicited for way back in 2015, and the proposed landing of its cable in East Hampton. But the transmission fight seems to be heading toward resolution now, and the construction and operation plan approval process at BOEM is expected to restart after a pause, and commercial operation is still set for the end of 2022. And then there's Great Lakes offshore wind. Long bandied about as a concept, building offshore wind facilities in Lake Erie to serve New York State load-serving entities got its first real recognition in the recent 70 by 30 white paper from NYSERDA and DPS. In that document, the state proposed a feasibility study, which should address not only the myriad of siting and permitting challenges on the state, federal, and international levels for such a facility, but also the cost and offtake questions for a resource that would be selling into upstate NYSO markets where the mix is already quite low carbon and wholesale market commodity prices are soft. So 2021 is a huge year for offshore wind here in New York and beyond. If the federal government turns to actively supporting the industry, we could see more lease areas being auctioned, an investment tax credit specific to offshore wind, significant funding for workforce development, a manufacturing tax credit that brings the supply chain onshore, and predictability and support for the resource at the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. Already contracted for projects would see their construction and operation plans move forward at reasonable, predictable paces. States hungry to procure more contracts would see more lease areas, leading to the competition they need to continue to bring prices down and spurring long-term integrated transmission planning and investment. And international manufacturers, shipbuilders, and others feeding the industry would see the long-term runway of government support at all levels that they need to make the big-time investment decisions. With that combination at the state and federal levels, offshore wind is poised to bring more than 10,000 good-paying jobs just here to New York State, a $70 billion supply chain along the East Coast, and a major piece of the puzzle for decarbonizing our electricity sector. If the chips fall right, 2021 and indeed the next decade could be extraordinary for New York's offshore wind industry. But stay tuned because the next few months will be crucial.
Great. Noah, can you tell us about the PPA rates that have been publicly disclosed? What ranges, not exact, but
For New York?
yeah, for the two that have been auctioned, if those.
Yeah. So importantly, the contracts are not sort of traditional PPAs with the utilities. They're contracts for the purchase and sale of RECs, just like any other large-scale renewable contract here in New York State. It's a little bit different than the fixed REC structure, and it's an index REC where the reference price is an average of the zones J and K prices for the prior month. But you know, the idea is similar, that you know, the value of the OREC will be what needs to be paid in order to support the resource. Those OREC prices were in the sort of $83, $84 range, mid 80s. It's hard to do apples to apples when comparing OREC prices to PPAs, because obviously the OREC prices, you know, strictly speaking, don't include the wholesale market revenue that's being procured from both energy and capacity. So you know, it's always a little shaky to actually look at and try to compare the New York prices to, say, PPA prices in New England. But I can tell you that the reaction from certainly those of us who were at NYSERDA when the projects were being solicited, and from the Public Service Commission, and I think the industry in general, were that the prices were extremely competitive and will continue to go down as capital costs continue to decrease, as markets, economies of scale continue to increase, and generally as the cost curve for offshore wind just plummets, both here in the United States and around the world.
Well, it's fantastic. So the state may be paying 8 cents a kilowatt as a subsidy for their REC, but so the wholesale power could be very competitive, 3, 4 cents, 5 cents, whatever.
No, that was the LCOE. I'm I'm blanking on exactly what the rec only value is, but certainly that doesn't include that number.
In other words, when a third of the power for the state or the capacity comes from offshore wind, we're not going to see big spikes in rates. It actually could be very competitive with existing sources.
I
The
think
net cost to the
the
consumer.
cost benefit analysis that's been done ad nauseum at the commission for the offshore wind program is shows an extraordinary value for the state, not only in terms of the overall cost of just the energy commodity, but also given all the benefits that come along with decarbonizing the sector, health benefits, jobs benefits, et cetera. So when you're thinking about the value of the resource, it's certainly not it should not be a narrow question.
All right. Well, so it's fantastic to see the big a piece of the puzzle, this 9 gigawatts, uh, fall into place, or the plans being put to see this come through in the next uh, 10 years. Uh, what do you see as the big issues, if there are them, that haven't been addressed in terms of implementing the whole CLCPA, New York's Green New Deal?
Well, I mean, specific to offshore wind, I think the big challenges over the course of the next, couple of years will really be largely whether the federal government continues to push forward with policies that are supportive of the overall goal. This industry in particular is, I wouldn't say dependent, because it will continue to flourish just because of the cost of the resource and the state's hunger for it. But the ceiling for the resource is so high with federal support, both with when it comes to new lease areas, more places to build the projects, supportive tax policy, support for the manufacturing sector in the United States. That will be the big question to be answered, and we may have the answer to that question on November 3rd. We'll see. And otherwise, from a sort of planning point of view, I think the transmission question is a big one. Do we move to an integrated transmission planning process? Think about a big plug that goes out into the ocean that all the different projects sort of plug into, or do we continue with the radial lines? That is, each project having its own transmission line interconnecting to a separate place onshore. That question and the value of each, and the interaction with Order 1000 and various dynamics on the federal level at the FERC. That is a set of issues that frankly the Europeans still haven't quite figured out, and that here in the United States we're also still grappling with.
Well, I'm glad that you and your partners at Hudson Russ are very involved. It has taken some very dedicated, intelligent people to come up with the plan, and now the hard part is actually implementing it. Uh, just one final question. So we've seen British Petroleum partnered with Equinor to invest in one of the fields. Have you seen other oil companies? Do you predict that they will be showing up and wanting to be owners of these assets, essentially converting, like British Petroleum has said, that they're going to become an energy company and carbon neutral? So,
well, I mean, it's already happened. I mean, frankly, oil companies that are not focused on offshore wind are the exception right now. Exxon, Chevron, I think, are the only majors that aren't in the game. Shell already has significant investments in lease areas in the United States. Equinor is formerly Statoil. I mean, Equinor has made a big shift. Ørsted, it used to be an oil company, and still has a range of assets, but is focused, significantly on offshore wind now worldwide. So this transition is not only expected, but already here, and significantly so. I think what we hope to see is that the American majors step up to the plate sometime soon. Building big stuff out in the ocean is something that people who have been building oil rigs for a long time are good at. So they should be able to make it work here in the United States.
excellent. Well, we hope to hear back as things progress. Thank
Right.
you
Thank you.
for presenting today.